أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Life is tough and full of obstacles and challenges, and it's those obstacles and challenges that make us go through suffering either for a short term or for a long term. And that suffering can happen at any moment in life, at any point, and it can be unexpected, and most of the time it is unexpected. For example, we might go through breakdowns in our relationships. We might go through financial difficulties, or we might go through health problems. Whatever the difficulty is, it causes a great deal of pain to the person undergoing through that difficulty. And suffering is not discriminatory. So therefore it affects everyone, not just the layperson, but it also affects the prophets. For example, we see the Prophet Ayyub. Prophet Ayyub was a very blessed individual. He had wealth, he had good health, he had property, he had children, he had everything that anyone could desire. So one day Allah was showing Prophet Ayyub off to his angels, because Prophet Ayyub was also an obedient servant to him. So Allah was showing him off to the angels, saying, "Look at my servant." And Shaitan questioned Allah at that point and said, "Allah, Prophet Ayyub is only like this. He only obeys you because you've given him everything. If he didn't have anything, then you'll see that he doesn't worship you." So Allah, with his wisdom, knew what the outcome would be, but he allowed Shaitan a little power over Prophet Ayyub, with the exception of having complete dominion over him, so that Shaitan could take away some of the blessings. So Shaitan, what he did first was he took away the wealth of Prophet Ayyub, because he saw that the wealth of Prophet Ayyub gave him a sense of security. But even at the end of the day, Prophet Ayyub, despite having lost all of his wealth, still prostrated to Allah in thankfulness to him for everything he had. So after seeing this, Shaitan took away the property of Prophet Ayyub, because he saw that the property of Prophet Ayyub gave him a sense of security. He had somewhere to live. So Shaitan took away his property, until a point that Prophet Ayyub had become homeless and he wasn't able to live in the city. He had to move out because he couldn't afford it. But even at the end of that day, Prophet Ayyub prostrated to Allah in thankfulness to him for everything that he had. So Shaitan decided to take away his children. But even after all of his children died, Prophet Ayyub still prostrated to Allah in thankfulness. And then lastly, Shaitan took away Prophet Ayyub's health, to the point that Prophet Ayyub, his condition had deteriorated so much that the people were disgusted to go near him, and they started to doubt his prophethood. They said that if you really are a prophet, then Allah wouldn't have subjected you to such suffering. But even at that point, Prophet Ayyub prostrated to Allah in thankfulness to him. And then Allah took control of the situation and said to Shaitan that, "See my servant, he prostrates to me even when he has nothing." And then in return for Prophet Ayyub's thankfulness to Allah, he gave him back everything that he had, and the children that he lost, he replaced them with new children. So therefore, we can see that suffering is a part of life, and life without suffering is unimaginable. However, it's important that we overcome the suffering and the difficulties that we go through, and therefore in tonight's discussion we'll talk about how we can overcome difficulties by considering the following points. The first point that we'll consider is, why does suffering happen, and what is the Islamic viewpoint on suffering? Number one. Number two, why do some people never suffer? And the famous question, why do bad things happen to good people? Number three, what are the benefits of suffering, and how can we overcome the suffering that befalls upon us? And number four, What can we learn from the life of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam? Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So we mentioned that suffering is a part of life, and without suffering, there almost is no life. But why does suffering happen? We already saw from the story of Prophet Ayub that suffering can happen as a result of Allah trying to test our faith, to see how unflinching we are towards prostrating towards Allah, even in the testing, and even in the most testing of times. But this isn't the only reason why we go through suffering. Some of the reasons we go through suffering is so that we become thankful. Humans by nature are forgetful, and so we often forget the things that we have, but we only realize the value of something we have once we've lost it. And if we did not have that thing that we lost, then we'd never truly be able to appreciate it. For example, if someone is in good health and then all of a sudden they're told that they only have 6 months to live, that person would naturally make changes to their life. I remember a long time ago watching a TV program in which people who were slightly obese would take part in challenges, and they were told by a doctor at the beginning of the show that this is how long you have to live. We would never be told at what age they die, but from the reaction, from their faces, we'd be able to see those people would start crying. And as a result of realizing that they've wasted away their life by indulging, by taking in junk food constantly without moderation, they realized that they had to make changes, and therefore they did make changes. So therefore, when someone undergoes suffering, they become thankful, and thankfulness is one of the traits of the believers. The second reason why we go through suffering is because suffering promotes growth. Robin Sharma, a world-renowned motivational speaker and an author of many books, he's written books such as The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. He's written an excellent book called The Leader Without a Title, and if you get a chance, please read that book, because reading the material of that book really reminds you of the Prophet in terms of how to engage in your daily life. So he's written this book, and in this book, he says that when someone wants to rebuild their character, it's important that they be completely broken down so they can rebuild something better. For example, when a construction company wants to build a building, for example, but there's already something in the way, the first course of action is demolition. They destroy what's there already so they can get rid of that which they don't need, get rid of that which isn't worth keeping anymore, so they can build something better on top of it. So there are many reasons why we suffer. One of them is to test our faith. The other one is to grow as individuals, and the third could be to become thankful. However, what is the Islamic viewpoint on suffering? Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The Islamic viewpoint on suffering is interesting because, as we saw from the story of Prophet Ayub, he suffered, however, he wasn't someone who had committed a sin. So one of the reasons, or one of the first thoughts that may come to our mind when we suffer is we might be suffering because of a sin that we committed. However, Prophet Ayub was not a sinner. He didn't sin, and therefore his suffering was not as a result of any sin that he committed. However, Imam Baqir alayhi salam has answered the question as to what the Islamic viewpoint is on suffering, and he says that suffering of a believer is a sign that Allah loves him, and when Allah loves a believer, he showers calamities upon them so that they may build themselves. This might be difficult to understand, but it can be understood by a few examples. For example, let's just take the example of a parent and a child. The parent knows that if a child who loves to eat certain foods, such as chocolates or sweets, the parent knows that overeating in this can lead to bad effects in the future. However, the child doesn't understand that at the time, and this is all the child wants. So what the parent does is he withholds junk food, or he withholds chocolates, or whatever it may be. He withholds it, but gives it to the child in moderation so as to allow the child to benefit from the future. No matter how much that child complains or how much that child cries for that thing, the parent knows it's responsible of them to prevent the child from difficulties in their future, such as obesity, such as diabetes, etc. So it's important that the parent be cruel to be kind. So therefore, why do some people never suffer? We often come across life and we sometimes find people who might not have gone through any difficulties. Firstly, we don't know if someone is suffering or not. However, from the outset, they might not be suffering. So why do some people not suffer? Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala. He said that, sorry, recite another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam has said that one of the signs of someone who doesn't suffer is, one of the reasons why someone who doesn't suffer is because Allah has left them completely, and he demonstrates this by narrating an event from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. The Prophet had one day attended the house of someone who had invited him for dinner. As the Prophet arrived at the person's house, he sat down for dinner and the person had served him with food. But just as the Prophet was about to start eating, he noticed a hen sitting on the top of a wall. That hen laid an egg and it fell towards the floor, and upon falling onto the floor, the egg landed on a nail, but the egg didn't break, it didn't even crack. The Prophet was surprised, and then that person, having seen the Prophet be so surprised, so proudly said, "This is nothing. I have never suffered in my life." At that point, the Prophet got up from his place and left the house without even eating. Why? Because a person who doesn't suffer, according to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and the Prophet, is a person whom Allah has completely left. So why do bad things happen to good people? Because although we may suffer all the time, although we may go through difficulties, we may fast, we may pray salah, we may give in charity, however, we might notice that there are still bad things happening to us. This can be answered in two ways. The first thing to remember, the first way is to answer this is, it's important to remember that bad things don't just happen to good people, but good things happen to good people too, and more so than the bad stuff. So for example, if we were to count our blessings, we wouldn't be able to count them as much as we may think, because Allah has given us so much. So for example, if we started to count right now, I have parents, I have security, I have a house to live in, I'm always served iftar. There are some people that aren't. So if I was to count my blessings, I'd be able to see that there are more good things in my life than the bad. So it's not just bad things that happen to good people, but good things happen to good people too. The second way to answer this question is as a matter of perception. What we perceive as good and what we perceive as bad. Something is only bad if we think it to be bad, but at the end it might not be. So for example, pregnancy. Pregnancy can be a very stressful time for both the husband and the wife, but during labor can be extremely painful. However, it's important or necessary for the mother of a child to go through the pain that she goes through in order to receive the result that she goes to. Pain on its own can be perceived as bad. However, in this situation, pain is necessary in order to receive the fruit of that which is a child. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So when answering the question as to why do bad things happen to good people, number one, good things happen to good people too. So it's not fair to say that bad things only happen. And number two, it's a matter of perception as to what we perceive as good and what we perceive as bad. So suffering, although it's necessary, has many benefits also. And I'd like to start this section by narrating to you something Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said to his companion. A companion of Imam Sadiq had come to him complaining to him as to all the suffering that he was undergoing. So Imam Sadiq reminded him as to the value of suffering. He said that if a believer only knew what he would gain through suffering, and if he knew what Allah would give him as a result of all the suffering that he goes through, he would want his suffering to be such that his body be cut into pieces with a scissor. Now, that seems extremely painful. However, Imam Sadiq was trying to emphasize the necessity and the reward that a believer gains after having gone through suffering. However, there are many other benefits to suffering. The first benefit to suffering is that it can be a tool for forgiveness. We may have gone through life and we may have committed sins, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is extremely merciful. And when He sees that a believer of His has or may have committed mistakes or sins, He may not want to punish them in the world to come. And therefore, in order to alleviate the suffering of the world to come, He gives them sufferings in this world so He doesn't have to face what's to come afterwards. The second benefit of suffering is that it helps us to develop patience. Patience is one of the signs of the believer. And Imam Jafar as-Sadiq has said that patience is to, he has said that patience is to faith like the head is to the body. We can survive if our arms were cut, we'd still be alive. Or we'd still be alive if our feet were cut off. But if our head was cut off, we wouldn't survive. So patience is a salvation for our iman. Without patience, our iman is in danger. And therefore, one of the benefits of suffering is that as individuals, it helps us to develop patience. So how can we overcome suffering? There are many ways that we can take practically to overcome suffering. However, I'm just going to name a couple. The first thing to do is to come to terms with the suffering that we have gone through. Once we acknowledge what we have gone through, we'll be able to better understand and appreciate the situation or the position that we currently are in now. And if we dwell on the past, if we don't let go of the suffering that we have gone through, this can result in negative consequences. For example, it can lead to stress or mental distress also. The second practical step to take when undergoing suffering or after overcoming suffering is to surround yourself with those whom you love the most. This may be your family or this may be your friends. When surrounded by individuals who love you, who you know will support you in any situation, then you're surrounded in a positive environment, and the energy that you receive from them will only be a positive one, which will help you forget about the suffering that you went through and also help you to overcome any remains of that suffering that may still be there. And I'd like to conclude this discussion by telling you about Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was a special prophet. He became the king of Egypt, but look at what he had to go through to get there. Number one, he lost his mother at a young age. Number two, he was separated from his father again at a young age. He was beaten up by his brothers. It was 11-1. They beat him up. His brothers whom was supposed to protect him. Number four, He was dumped in a well and left there for days. Imagine how scary it would have been for a child at night time. It would have been extremely dark. Number 5, he was sold into slavery. Number 6, he grew up in a palace in which was a constant danger for him. Yes, he grew up as a servant, and as things were starting to look up, all of a sudden he was accused of adultery and sent to prison, despite the evidence being against Zuleika and for him. So he was sent to prison, and he wasn't sent to prison just for a few days or a few weeks. He was sent to prison for 7 years, and we know the story after that. So what can we learn from the life of Prophet Yusuf? His story is very interesting. It teaches us that life has many ups and downs. However, with patience and prayer, it's important for us to remember that Allah always has a plan for us, and He doesn't give us that which we cannot bear. So all the puzzle pieces fall into place in the end, and with patience and prayer, we can overcome our difficulties just as Prophet Yusuf did. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.